Hey sailors, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Janda, and this is my Let's Play of Rule the Waves 3 as the United States, the 1950 special, in which we will be taking a look at all of the various ships in commission around the world and the state of the fleets of the world. Now, at this point, we're essentially past the battleship era. Obviously, there are still quite a few in commission, so we can call it sort of the very late battleship era. But carriers have become probably the dominant ships at this point. Aside from which, cruiser and destroyer fleets continue to swell. The weakest country in the world is now Spain, while we as the United States have become the largest naval power by some margin. Well, not a huge margin, only about 150,000 tons over Japan. Britain, Germany, France, and Russia have all been more or less smacked down so much that they're not exactly a serious threat to the US anymore. So let's take a look at what's in service. Everyone has absolute piles of aircraft at this point, although the US has the second most behind Great Britain, which is pretty good considering the AI has a habit of building them in just absolutely every location they own in the entire world. Submarines, we're lagging behind on a bit, although the other major Britain is the only major nation that actually has a significant number. Spain, Austria, Hungary, and Russia and Italy all have quite a few. I would say probably almost half of the world's total submarines are in the Mediterranean, which makes sense as an operating theater for them. There's a few AMCs and corvettes in service. The majority of the world's fleets essentially start with the destroyers. Now, Spain has, and everybody has a lot of these to be fair, Spain has the least at 62, amounting to 111,000 tons. Now, to be fair, you will note that's solidly under half the tonnage of the US projected 100, to be fair, but more than half the ships, not half the tonnage, not particularly close to half the tonnage either. Out of the Spanish destroyer fleet, a lot are these old T-30 class with three 4-inch guns. Two triple torpedo tubes make 33 knots from the 1920s. They have a few with three 5-inch guns, four 5-inch guns, 34 knots. Two quadruple torpedo tubes. They switched to that sort of design about 1930, but only built a couple of them. In the last decade, they did build their destroyer fleet up a fair bit, with first this run of 8 5-inch dual-purpose gun, two quadruple torpedo tube 34-knot destroyers, the T-51s, and then oddly went back to a 2,000-ton design, more of a torpedo boat design, I guess you would call it. Only four 4-inch dual-purpose guns, but 36 knots, and I'm assuming three quadruple torpedo tubes. So this is very much a torpedo boat type destroyer. Only with their, to go exactly the opposite way again, with six 6-inch and eight 4-inch guns somehow crammed into this 3,000-ton destroyer, along with two quad torpedo tubes, although they only built two of those. Their most recent runs of ships have been mostly armed with what appears to be six 4-inch guns, two quadruple torpedo tubes, 33 knots, which makes them honestly just pretty straightforwardly outdated and unhelpful as destroyers. Although most recently, they've been building some of these with eight 5-inch guns, two quad tubes, but only 32 knots, which is rather slow. And a couple more of these six 6-inch gun armed ships. Now, Austria-Hungary, the next largest naval power, has 71 destroyers amounting to 141,000 tons, which is actually more than France by tonnage, interestingly. Their older ships from the 20s are your typical 3 4-inch, 3 5-inch gunships. Then a long line of ships with 8 4-inch guns, 2 quadruple torpedo tubes, 35 knots from the late 20s. They built a mix of ships in the 30s, some with 4 5-inch, 6 4-inch, 3 5-inch, all with 8 5-inch, all with 2 quadruple torpedo tubes. Obviously, this 8 5-inch T-32 class is probably the strongest, if also much more expensive than the others. And 35 knots, not bad. In the 1940s, they've built this run of ships with 4 5-inch guns, 2 quad tubes. Then the very large Spalatos with 6 6-inch, 8 4-inch, 34 knots, 2 quadruple torpedo tubes. Before going back to 8 4-inch, and then more recently seem to be alternating between 8 4 and 8 5-inch guns with 2 quadruple torpedo tubes. I see no evidence that either Spain or Austria-Hungary has missiles on their destroyers, which, spoiler, is something the U.S. is developing by this time. Although none of the Ericssons are actually quite in commission, so to be fair, probably no one has missiles just yet in January 1950. Then Italy, the last Mediterranean power, has 68 destroyers amounting to 147,000 tons, quite comparable to Austria-Hungary, but just a little bit heavier on average. They do still have quite a few of these old 4 5-inch gun-armed 2 quad torpedo tube 33 knot destroyers, though some of them are 35 knot, but it doesn't really make up for only having 4 5-inch guns. They built some with 6 4-inch or 3 6-inch guns, or even just 3 5-inch guns, although there's a couple with 8 5-inch here. 4 5-inch, and then they have had a pretty consistent run in the 1940s of ships with either 8 5-inch or 8 4-inch, or a few with 8 6-inch guns, although I see a couple with 6 6-inch guns. Although a lot of them with 8 5-inch only have 2 twin torpedo tubes, or maybe 1 quad. I can't really quite make it out. Which is really pretty inadequate for a destroyer at this time. Let's see, a few with 8 6-inch guns. The AI rarely, it seems, builds really consistent classes of destroyers at close to their maximum tonnage, although they are building a class of 3,000 tonners right now. Now, Russia has 79 destroyers amounting to 159,000 tons, which is actually, by tonnage, the third largest destroyer force in the world. They have a few old Bezuprechny and Bezposchadnys from the early 30s, really, with 4 5-inch guns. And then they built this very long series, right about 1940, of Baldrys and Sukrushitelnys, with 3 4-inch guns, 33 knots, 2 quad torpedo tubes. I guess these are torpedo boats, but they're not even fast enough to be good torpedo boats, so I don't know what the hell is up with these. Very strange choice to only arm them with 3 4-inch guns. They then went to 8 5-inch guns, 3 6-inch guns, which is better than 3 4-inch guns, but really still not enough. Okay, but 4 4-inch, I mean, this is just unconventional, and I don't like it, but at least it would probably work. 8 5-inch, 6 6-inch. Okay. Well, the real killer by tonnage, I guess, is the recent series of T-29 and T-44 class destroyers, which have 8 6-inch guns, 6 5-inch guns, 2 quad torpedo tubes, and make 34 knots, at the cost of being 3,000 tons, of course, but that is a lot of firepower for a destroyer, gunnery-wise, at least. Albeit our missile-armed destroyers will make them a little bit obsolete, probably. Now, Great Britain is actually the, one, two, three, four, fifth largest naval power in the world. And their destroyer fleet does reflect that, being 65 ships amounting to 129,000 tons. Apparently, in trying to rebuild their other forces, they've neglected their destroyers because they only have a larger destroyer force than Spain out of everyone in the world. They have also quite a few still of these old 1920s ships with 3 5-inch guns in service. And although there are some with 8 5-inch or 8 4-inch guns here, They went on quite a run of ships in the early 30s with 4 or 5 inch guns and 2 quad tubes, and they only make 32 knots, which at this point, some of them make 35 knots at least, but are pretty dated at this point. Now, in fairness to them, 6 4-inch, they did also then go on a pretty long run just a few years ago. This Ariel class with 8 6-inch, 6 4-inch guns, 2 quad tubes, 2,900 tons, 35 knots. These are very formidable destroyers, but they only have about, what, 10, 12 of them, something like that. And they then went back down to 8 5-inch or 8 4-inch guns. These are pretty standard, definitely functional ships, though now they've gone back down to 6 4-inch guns, which is strange. These ships are all pretty functional, except maybe the very latest ones, but they don't have enough of them for Britain's naval commitments, or really for the fact that they do still have the second largest budget in the world. Now, France has 72 destroyers, amounting to 138,000 tons, more or less. This includes some old ships from the 20s with 4 5-inch guns, quite a few of them actually, which are not very practical at the present, and they built some with 3 5-inch guns as well. But they do have a lot with 8 5-inch. Ooh, but in all these 4 4-inch, I don't understand why the AI does things like that. Okay, to be fair, these with 4 4-inch guns do have 3 quad torpedo tubes and make 37 knots, which is going to make them pretty terrifying torpedo boats. But they won't fare well against other destroyers, most likely. Heavier, with 8 5-inch guns or something. They do look a little allergic to 5-inch guns, as they've built a lot of ships with 6 or 8 4-inch guns, and a few with 6 6-inch guns and 8 4-inch guns, but none with 5-inch guns, until very recently with the Fagnon class. A lot of these are quite small ships, really. All these 6 4-inch, 2 quad torpedo tube ships are very small compared to the smallest American destroyers are 1,900 tons now, and probably the average is over 2,000. Yeah, definitely. That's without counting the Ericssons, which, with the power of hindsight, we can say comfortably are soon to replace everything. After France, we have Germany, which has the world's largest destroyer fleet by numbers, with 100 in service, amounting to 213,000 tons, as a bunch of those American destroyers under construction, counted in the tonnage, shouldn't be yet, really. It's probably safe to say Germany actually has the world's largest destroyer force as of January 1950, albeit soon to change thanks to the American buildup. Only a couple with 3 5-inch guns, but quite a collection of V-79s and similar with 4 5-inch guns, 34 knots from the 20s. Not so impressive. And then Jaguars with 8 4-inch guns, 3 6-inch, 6 4-inch. I mean, all of these ships, keeping in mind that the very worst American destroyers have 8 5-inch guns and 2 quadruple torpedo tubes and make 34 knots. All of these ships with, only 4 guns or only 4-inch guns, they're really... I mean, of course, in a destroyer versus destroyer fight, a lucky torpedo could easily decide the engagement either way, pretty much at random anyway. But I'm not too convinced of any of these destroyer designs in 1950 that have less than 8 guns or only 4-inch guns or anything like that, The 3 6-inch, 4 5-inch gun arm ships, 35 knots, these are pretty formidable at least. So those aren't bad. But then back to 6 4-inch, 4 4-inch, 3 6-inch. Okay, well, these are at least have the 4 4-inch as well. 3 4-inch, 4 4-inch. These, however, this run of Z58s and similar with 8 6-inch, 6 4-inch, 2 quad torpedo tubes, 34 knots. I mean, these have a lot of gun power, so those are quite nice. Recently, they finally put out a standardized class of Z69s with 8 5-inch guns, 35 knots, 2 quad torpedo tubes, which are quite nice as well, albeit not perfect. Just for the fact that they're being built in 1950, you could almost expect to get a little more out of that, but they're not terrible. And then Japan. Japan has 97 destroyers, albeit amounting only to 157,000 tons, which means the average tonnage of those 97 destroyers is quite low. And yeah, a lot of them are these 1920s or early 30s designs with 3 5 inch, 3 4 inch, 4 5 inch, etc. type numbers of guns. Some of them have probably 3 triple tubes. Most of them have 2 quad tubes by the look of it. But a huge, huge number of their total fleet. And then right into the 40s, they kept on building with only, 3 4 inch, 4 5 inch. They are at least, well, a lot of them aren't fast. Some of them, like this class, are the Ashishimos, but the Hakazes only make 33 knots, which isn't impressive at all. They built one with 8 6-inch guns, 6 5-inch guns, but she's literally a one-off. Then 6 4-inch. 8 5-inch is good, but then back to 6 4-inch. Really, this very modern Uzuki class are about the only destroyers Japan has that can stand up in gun power to an American destroyer, any American destroyer. And I mean, there's only four of them, in fact, plus this one-off Hokaze. So yeah, I mean, Japan's got a lot of destroyers, but they're not very powerful on average, it must be said. And finally, the US currently has 80 destroyers, with another 20 building for 231,000 tons. About, oh, I don't know, 30 or so out of the 80, probably. Maybe even 40 are of the old Winslow class, which was built from the late 20s, mid to late 20s through about 1930-ish. These are 1,900 tons, 34 knots, 8 5-inch guns, 2 quadruple torpedo tubes. They came with depth charge throwers, mines, just to take up space. These are pretty standard archetypal late interwar or just interwar type destroyers. Honestly, even in 1950, against most of what the AI is building, they're pretty comparable. I'm not saying they're the latest and greatest, but they would honestly still get the job done in most cases. That being said, they were succeeded in the mid 30s by the 35-36 run of about, oh, there were probably more of them at some point, but now there's about maybe a dozen or so Perry class destroyers. 2,200 tons. They make 36 knots, 8 5-inch guns, dual purpose, which the Winslows were not. 2 quadruple torpedo tubes, better director firing. For an extra 300 tons, these ships are pretty much superior and more modern in every way. By, 2 knots and better fire control, and I think an extra depth charge thrower, and so on. Oh no, one less, actually. No, same number. But 2 knots, a better fire control, maybe a couple other tweaks under the hood. Overall, better ships, but honestly, probably still almost a toss-up in a combat. And then we have the really pretty much the destroyer class of the 40s, built 41 all the way through 49. The Pattersons, of which we've probably got about 30 or so. They comprise the remainder of the active force. 2,400 tons, 36 knots, 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 10 torpedo tubes in, I believe, 2 quad and 1 twin tube, probably. Well, this is my own ship class, so I can certainly take a look at the blueprints. Hold on. Oh no, 2 quintuple mounts. Didn't even realize that we'd. Well, I'm sure I knew at some point that we'd done that, but I'd forgotten. 2 quintuple mounts on the Pattersons. Right. 8 5-inch guns, 36 knots, 4 depth charge throwers. These are pretty much the final word in the sort of conventional World War II era destroyer for the U.S. I would maintain that from all I've just seen of the AI, these are pretty much still state of the art in 1950. I don't think I saw anything. Well, okay. I saw a couple of, 3,000 ton destroyers that were better in gun power, but obviously weighed over 500 tons more. And there was nothing that radical departure wise about their design. I would say there's a couple things out there that will beat the Pattersons ship for ship, but they exist in much larger numbers than any of those ships that might beat them ship for ship. Overall, these are probably still the dominant class of destroyers as of 1950. That being said, there are, at this moment, 20 of the Erickson class under construction, 3,000 tons, 36 knots, two quadruple torpedo tubes. I have been notified that the 5-inch guns are not dual purpose. I realize that now. I will go back and refit them all at some point. That being said, they do at least have radar guided AA, which is a big step forward. And of course, the most fundamental improvement is that they all come equipped with the first 4 surface to surface missile tubes mounted on any American warship, or to the best of my knowledge, any warship in the world, which makes these the first guided missile destroyers, as it were, and essentially revolutionary ships for the entire field of naval warfare. Now, obviously, that's a bit of a peek into the future because none are actually in commission as of January 1950, but there are due to be 20 in commission within roughly a year, many within 6 months. So it's certainly coming along, and well, spoilers, but there's going to be 100 of them encompassing the entire U.S. fleet within about 2 years. So it would be weird to not mention them, honestly. Anyway, that brings us on to light cruisers. Spain has a fleet of 7, amounting to about 85,000 tons, with 2 more building. Now, the oldest of these are actually pretty new. In fact, they built all 7 of the ships that they have in commission about 1938, 1940, the Gravina class. And these are quite formidable light cruisers, I must say. Fair play to Spain. 10,000 tons, 32 knots, 15 5-inch dual-purpose guns. Oh, wait, that's the problem. Oh, God, never mind. I take back everything I just said. My mind had just kind of automatically assumed that they used an actual cruiser caliber of guns. However, to have a 10,000 ton ship with only 5-inch guns? Come on, Spain. I mean, okay. This thing can almost keep pace with even modern destroyers. It will slaughter modern destroyers if it doesn't get hit by a torpedo, of course, but the 15 5-inch guns and 12 4-inch guns will absolutely chew through even the most modern destroyers. What they will not do, however, is beat other light cruisers, although they will probably penetrate the armor of other light cruisers, and that's 27 gun barrels, which isn't bad. And it's a lot of flak, too, so maybe this is sort of an AA cruiser, considering they're all dual purpose. But look, even against a light cruiser with, like, probably one with 8 6-inch guns it would beat, but a light cruiser with 12 6-inch guns would almost certainly beat the Gravina class, and would probably be less tonnage. So, questionable. Especially as these are literally, okay, if they had some dedicated AA cruisers, or destroyer hunting cruisers, or whatever, that might be one thing. It is literally the only class of light cruisers they have, so I've got to question that pretty hard, Spain. Now, Austria-Hungary has 13 light cruisers, amounting to 119,000 tons, which are all also fairly new. They built the Artemisia's sisters in the mid 30s, and those are the oldest. 6,800 tons, 32 knots, 9 6-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 8 4-inch, 2 triple torpedo tubes, it looks like. They pack a fair bit of firepower onto that tonnage, actually. I assume they're very cramped and short-ranged or something, but they're not bad ships from the look of it. And they followed that with 4 Jupiters in 1939 through 41, which with 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets, 12 4-inch, 31 knots, 9,600 tons, 2 triple torpedo tubes, a couple of aircraft. These have a legitimately large amount of firepower. Now, their armor belt is non-existent, but to be fair, all those 2 3-inch belts, which even I use, are not actually very helpful against modern 6-inch guns, so it probably doesn't hurt her that much. Speed's a little low, but not terrible. Overall, relatively impressed with the Jupiter class. Obviously, only 4 exist, but not bad. Unfortunately, they then threw all of that goodwill away with the 6 ships of the Taurus class in the early 40s, which have 14 5-inch dual-purpose guns and what appears to me to be 7 twin turrets, of which 5 are centerline and 2 are mounted on the wings, plus 2 triple torpedo tubes, but a thick 3.5-inch armor belt. Okay. Unfortunately, this absolutely throws away everything good I'd said about their previous cruisers. This thing is horrifying. It's so bad. Why does it have wing turrets for its primary armament? Why is it a 9,600-ton cruiser with only 5-inch guns? Why does it have more armor than their cruisers that actually had 6-inch guns? The world may never know, but this is a garbage ship. And unfortunately, they followed it up with what appears to be an identical twin, but with less armor, and yet weighs 100 tons more. So this is actually just even worse. I don't know what the hell they... Maybe it's less cramped or short-ranged or something, but they seem to have just made it worse. Yeah, that's pretty bad, actually, Austria, in the end. Now, Italy has a very impressive 19 heavy cruisers amounting to 177,000 tons, which is actually the 3rd largest force in the world, tied by numbers, but clearly on tonnage. Quite solid. It looks like it's probably at the cost of lagging behind in their carriers, but not compared to the other Mediterranean powers, so they're doing all right. Now, these, they have the old Aquati from 1927 still in service. And, you know, I wouldn't call her modern, but she's not bad. 8 6-inch guns, 8 4-inch guns, 4 twin torpedo tubes, 32 knots, 2-inch belt. She's certainly not, I mean, depending on the degree of modernization she may or may not have received, but she doesn't look to me like she's utterly helpless against modern cruisers, albeit the U.S. no longer has any light cruisers with less than 12 6-inch guns, but, I mean, at least they're 6-inch guns. Unlike Tripoli of similar vintage, 5,000 tons, 8 5-inch guns. This ship is both slower than and outgunned by most modern destroyers, despite being twice their size. Okay, yes, she has a bit of armor, but there's a very real objective possibility that a Patterson-class destroyer just flat-out wins a gunfight with this cruiser. Especially if they get close enough for torpedoes to come into play. Which means that this cruiser is terrible. It was honestly not good even in 1927, but now it's just horrifying. Wow, okay, the number of AI designs that are going for this all 5-inch layout is horrifying. But they then built 7 Quarto-class ships, which appear to be identical to the Austrian ships I just so roundly criticized, and I will say exactly the same thing about the Italians. The only possible thing I can think is that they're dedicated AA ships, basically. But surely, I mean, really objectively, just build more carriers instead? I'm not really sure the evidence bears out that dedicated AA ships actually work particularly well. And they built these ships in like 1940 when they would not have been sure that air power was going to dominate the future for sure. And they're all but helpless against a cruiser with 6-inch guns. And they're a very large portion of Italy's total cruiser fleet. So what the hell? And they followed that with 4 Libyas, which appear to take the same design up a notch with an additional 5-inch turret. Yay! And slower, I think, and carries a ton of mines. It's worse. I think this design is maybe even worse. Um, Although to be fair, it's 2,100 tons lighter for the extra guns. So I guess that arguably makes this more viable or affordable as some kind of dedicated AA slash auxiliary design. In that sense, it's maybe actually better, but just why? Fortunately, sanity has prevailed in the last few years with 6 Alberto de Giussiano class cruisers, 11,300 tons, 32 knots, 12 6-inch guns in what appears to be 4 triple turrets, 16 4-inch guns, 2 triple torpedo tubes, 3-inch belt, couple of aircraft. I'm not really convinced of the utility of scouting aircraft on cruisers, even in general, but especially in the Mediterranean operational environment where surely you're almost always in range of your land based air. I mean, this is 1950. Or of a carrier, if nothing else, because Italy has carriers. So what I'm saying is that I feel like those 2 aircraft are mostly a waste of tonnage, but okay. They don't really hurt anything that much. This is a pretty nice cruiser design, really. 32 knots, 12 6-inch guns, 3-inch belt, a lot of secondaries, dual purpose, good for AA. I've got no objections to the Alberto de Giussianos. They're pretty comparable to my cruisers of the same period, albeit a lot more tonnage, and I'm not quite sure. I think it's because of so many extra 4-inch guns, probably mainly. Although, actually, my cruisers of the very most recent vintage have even more guns than that, but we'll get to that later. Right. That brings us on to Russia, which also has 19 light cruisers in service, joint second, albeit a lot the least tonnage out of anybody with 19 cruisers at 160,000 tons. They have the old Slavas from the early 30s, which at 5,500 tons, 6 6-inch and 8 3-inch guns are pretty much sitting ducks to most modern cruisers. They are, yeah, they're useless. Then 6 Krasny Krims, which appear to be the AA cruiser type design. I'm going to be, no, you know what? Russia does not even get that excuse because those aren't dual purpose 5-inch guns. So this is just complete garbage. I don't know what else you want me to say about it. Yes, it has a lot of guns. It will probably tear apart destroyers. That's it. It's 9,400 tons. It had better tear apart destroyers. Against other 9,400 ton cruisers, such as these, it will be obliterated in a head to head combat. So I don't know what the hell Russia's doing. Fortunately, they then topped that with the Tbilisi class, which at least can excuse itself on the basis of only being 5,300 tons and actually having dual purpose 5-inch guns. But it's clearly some sort of auxiliary, like mine laying slash AA cruiser. It would absolutely be torn apart in combat with other modern cruisers. But I'll let that one off with a warning, considering it is only 5,300 tons and thus quite affordable. And you wouldn't expect it to go toe to toe with 9,000 ton cruisers. Fortunately, Russia has also begun to turn itself around since then with the 4-ship Orfei class, 9 6-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 8 3-inch, 2-inch belt, 32 knots, 8,400 tons. Okay, there's nothing wrong. This class is a little weakly armed for when it was built. And it carries an absurd number of mines for no particular reason that I can see, but it's not horrible. And they then managed to build Harsones, a one-off with 12 6-inch guns and 4 triple turrets, which is actually quite a nice ship. And most recently, they've gone with Mesembria, which is an 11,700-ton cruiser, 33 knots, 18 6-inch guns, 23-inch dual purpose. I'm trying to... Yeah, 6 triple turrets, all center line. So this ship's got a hell of a lot. This is a very powerful light cruiser. It's just that she's a one-off currently, but they are building a sister for her. We'll see if they follow that up any further. Obviously, single cruisers don't really have a big influence on the balance of power at this point. Everybody's got a dozen or more, pretty much. Britain also is the third out of 4 powers, tied at 19 light cruisers for some reason. Coming in pretty much in the middle at 167,000 tons, just on the lower end of average. They have the old Canada. Okay, to be fair, they have no light cruisers older than 1943. I think that's our fault from the war we fought with them. But, yeah. Now, the old Latona, 9,800 tons. Old, I say, 7 years old. 9,800 tons, 31 knots. 15 6-inch guns and 5 triple turrets, 12 4-inch, 3-inch belt. This is quite a nice cruiser all around. Unfortunately, they then have the 5 Polaris class, which have 10 5-inch guns and I guess are the mine-laying auxiliary type. I mean, I'm not impressed by this type. I don't understand why the AI are building so many of them. Surely, based on the overall relative efficiency of airstrikes that I've seen, I'm not convinced that any dedicated light AA cruisers or whatever are actually having any noticeable impact on the effectiveness of air operation. I'm sure they do a little bit, but I feel like one carrier would probably have a bigger impact on your ability to defend against air raids than all of those light cruisers. And probably would be cheaper. And they then built 4 Arathusas with 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, some of which appear to be mounted in wing turrets. Yeah, complete trash. I don't know what the hell to say about all these AI designs that are Palace class. Functionally, they're not identical, yeah. I mean, heavier, more armor. Don't know what that's supposed to do. A bunch of torpedo tubes and mines. Why? Who knows? They just like having mines on their cruisers. I mean, not that mines hurt, but they're putting enough on there that they've clearly dedicated, like, significant spare tonnage just to mines, and I'm not really sure that's worth it. On what's clearly not supposed to be a dedicated mine laying cruiser, at least I wouldn't think. And then they've built 5 Terpsichores with 14 5-inch guns apiece. Yay, still in wing turrets. Only makes 30 knots. Why? Yeah. I don't understand these 5-inch gun designs. I really don't. I mean, I assume they're either supposed to work against destroyers or against aircraft or a bit against both. But there are such things as other light cruisers with 6-inch guns out there still. You know? I feel like these are just trying to take the role that destroyers are really supposed to fill, um, in terms of like fleet screening or auxiliary duties. I mean, is a light cruiser not supposed to be a viable independent combat unit anymore? To be fair, things are less and less with air power around, but yeah. And then the problem is, of course, like, I mean, the modern US, for instance, has dedicated AA cruisers, but that's a very different aircraft environment and a very different technological environment in terms of, if they could build these light cruisers and cover them in a couple dozen SAMs, that would be another story entirely. But they just have dual purpose 5-inch guns, which are really not the absolutely optimal solution against either surface ships or aircraft. If they really, really, really wanted dedicated AA, they should just pile on more and more 3-inch guns or something, surely. Like, yeah, I'm not sold. Not sold on this concept. And then they've built two peaks which have six 6-inch and four 3-inch guns. So these are just even worse because they don't even have an excuse. They're just bad. They're not even trying to be AA ships or anything. They're just small and helpless. I don't know what the hell they're doing in existence right now. Anyway, France. 18 cruisers amounting to 135,000 tons, which is not a lot. They must have some very small cruisers in service. And I can tell you at a glance, I'm not going to like this, because all but the first two cruisers on this list have only 5-inch guns. Yay. And the first two cruisers were built in the 30s and only have six 6-inch and eight 3-inch guns, 32 knots. You know what? They're still the best cruisers France has anyway. At least for only 5,500 tons, you get almost a full complement of 6-inch guns, and enough dual-purpose guns to be somewhat helpful against aircraft. And you get some sort of torpedoes and some good speed. They're 5,500 tons. I think that tonnage is used pretty well. And then here's a 7,300-ton ship that probably would beat it in a head-to-head fight, to be fair, because 6 guns against 16 is a lot, but, like, it's 7,300 tons. And it only has 5-inch guns. Why? Why? So they built 3 of those. They built 6 Friants with only 10 5-inch guns, but a pile of mines. I mean, at least they're small. They built 3 the Asses, which 16 5-inch guns, including wing turrets. They're very similar to the Lalams, but big, heavier for some reason. Not sure what they added. They are, however, asses. And then 4 de Entrecastos, which are just the small type of dedicated. I feel like I'm being generous in calling these AA cruisers. I don't know if that's actually if a programmer or the AI or whatever has that in mind, or if they're just weird and bad, but yeah, I'm not a fan. Maybe some of you guys will be, but I'm not. Germany also has 19 light cruisers, amounting to 174,000 tons, which is the second most for having 19 anyway. Now they have no less than 7 of the old Danzig class from the early 30s, which, joy of joys, have 9 6-inch guns and 8 4-inch guns in 3 triple turrets on just 6,900 tons, 32 knots. Obviously, these are showing their age a little. The latest cruiser types will beat them, but for their age and tonnage, quite nice to cruisers, I would say. they'll probably beat pretty much any of those 5-inch gun only types we've seen around. Even the ones with like 15 probably would lose to these. It'd be a toss up at best. They then did weirdly go backwards with the Stralsund class, which has 7 6-inch and 4 4-inch guns, and yet is heavier. I don't know where two guns went that it's heavier, and are they all in single turrets? Okay, yeah, the Stralsunds are garbage. I don't understand why these are all in single turrets, but that's horrifying. Especially as two of them are wing turrets. I don't know what they were going for there. And they followed that with 6 Akins, which are, look at that, they're the A type design with 15 5-inch guns, not dual purpose, so they're only actually good against destroyers, I guess. And 6 4-inch guns. See, the thing is, yes, these would make pretty good fleet screens to try to hold off destroyers, but they're not actually as fast as destroyers. They're only close to as fast. And honestly, with their size, they're pretty vulnerable to a lucky torpedo hit from a destroyer, obliterating them. And they probably cost about as much as like 4 destroyers, if not more. So and it would be better if they only had a couple, but with Germany is probably the least bad offender out of the ones I've looked at recently, but most of these fleets have just like almost only these 5-inch gun armed cruisers for built in like the last 10 years. So I don't know what the hell's going on there. And then they built 2 Lebecks, which are the same but even worse. They're heavier and have 1 less gun. But are 1 not faster. Which might actually be a good trade off, but 300 tons heavier is just extra waste of money, honestly, so I don't know. Japan has the world's largest light cruiser force at 25 ships, amounting to 220,000 tons. Now, the oldest of these is Yoshino from the late 20s, 7,600 tons, 8 6-inch and 8 4-inch guns, 33 knots. Very standard at the time. Honestly, doesn't stand up that badly in the modern era, considering what we've been looking at in terms of just horror show 5-inch gun-armed cruisers. Japan then went that route with 2 Takasagos with 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns. At least they're tiny, so they didn't waste that much money on these. But they would probably lose to destroyers, so not great still. They probably wouldn't actually lose to destroyers, not 1 destroyer anyway. But it probably cost about as much as 2 destroyers, and 2 destroyers would certainly beat it. And the other reason it wouldn't lose to 1 destroyer is because it can just absorb more damage with its bulk, basically. In fairness, they look to have stayed a lot more sane than most powers, to the point of being rather frightening, because they then built 3 Kasakis of 7,000 tons with 9 6-inch guns, 3 triple turrets, 32 knots. These are quite nice. Obviously not the latest and greatest, but quite nice. And then in the late 30s, they built no less than 7 of the Akashi class, which clock in at 10,000 tons, 31 knots, 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 2 triple torpedo tubes, a 4-inch armor belt. Yeah, these are very, very slightly on the slow side, but very well armed, well armored, especially for a light cruiser. This is quite a formidable cruiser class, actually. The Akashis, I'm very impressed by those, really. Unfortunately, they then built 3 Tenirus, which have 16 5-inch guns, including the whole wing turret thing and all that, so those are garbage. But after that relatively modest waste, they then returned to form with 4 Tama class, which 10,000 tons like the Akashis, but pack even more into it. 32 knots, 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets, 18 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 4 triple torpedo tubes, only a 2-inch belt, which is where they made the compromise to save some weight, but that's probably worth it for a light cruiser. Even 4 inches of armor is not necessarily that much against 6-inch guns in 1950. Outstandingly well armed, fast enough, not particularly under-armored still. The Tamas are quite a formidable class of cruisers, I would have to say. And then they followed that up with the 3 relatively affordable Hashidates, which at 8,600 tons, well, 12 6-inch guns and 4 triple turrets, 8 4-inch, 2 triple torpedo tubes, make 33 knots. Thinly armored, not as well armed, but still quite well armed, and fast. So there's certainly nothing wrong with those either. And then most recently, they've built the 2 Natoris, which are just, well, 11,800 tons, make 33 knots, 18 6-inch guns in 6 triple turrets, 23-inch dual-purpose guns, 2 triple torpedo tubes, 2.5-inch belt. Fast, extremely well armed, even reasonably armored. The 2 Natoris are very, very dangerous light cruisers, I would have to say. Okay, out of all the AA powers, Japan, easily the most capable light cruiser force that I've seen. Very, very impressive for me, especially as they have twice as many of them as we do. Not all of them are as modern as ours, but still. So the American fleet, as of 1950, consists of only 12 light cruisers. Actual tonnage is probably more like 120,000 tons or something, if even that. So effectively near the smallest. Albeit, as you can see, 8 are building, which will take us up quite a bit. The existing fleet consists of 9 Cincinnati-class ships built, well, 1 in the late 30s, but mostly launched about 1940. Now, these still hold up reasonably well. 9,400 tons, 32 knots, 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 6 4-inch dual-purpose guns, so a little light on the secondaries, 2 triple torpedo tubes, 2-inch belt, 2-inch deck. I would call these solid and sound, but probably unexceptional for 1950. That said, the 12 6-inch guns, they will absolutely destroy any of those 5-inch designs that we saw. Just 100%. I'd pretty much bet my life on it. The 6 4-inch guns probably could stand for some upgrading in the modern era. And in general, they're probably due a refit, but they're just getting replaced anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Then in 1945, 3 San Franciscos were launched, which are definitely among the most powerful cruisers on the waters right now, with 11,600 tons, 33 knots, 16 6-inch guns in... What even are they in? 3... 5 total turrets? I'm going to have to check. I don't know how exactly we got that layout. It's a mixed, yeah. 4 triple, oh, I didn't see the 6th turret. I see, probably my designing. 4 triple and 2 twin turrets, 16 6-inch guns. Plus 8 4-inch guns, 2 triple torpedo tubes, 2-inch belt, 2-inch deck, and some mines just for fun. Obviously big and expensive, but also very well armed, fast. Not the heaviest secondaries, but enough. Plenty of AA, relatively. I mean, as much as I could pile onto her anyway. I would say the San Franciscos are still pretty much able to stand up to just about anything we've seen out there. There's maybe a couple of... Sorry. There's maybe a very rare couple of even heavier light cruisers, but not a lot. In any case, pretty much all of these are due to be surpassed shortly by, well, we've laid down 8 Raleigh-class light cruisers of 12,000 tons. The first 4 of which are due in just 3 months at this point. The next 4 for not a little over a year yet, but this will replace pretty much the entirety of the Cincinnati's, almost, I believe. Now, these are our biggest cruisers ever built at 12,000 tons, 33 knots, 16 6-inch guns in 4 triple and 2 twin turrets, 8 4-inch. Now, if you're looking at that and saying, well, this is just a San Francisco, for the most part, you'd be right, except, of course, 14 torpedo tubes in. What is it? In 2 quadruple and 2 triple mounts. Now, obviously, that's a massive number of torpedoes, particularly for a cruiser. The long-term plan is to remove those torpedoes and replace them with surface-to-surface missiles, which were not yet really a thing or not available on cruisers. I can't remember the details, but they weren't ready to be installed on the Raleighs when they were designed. But they will be not too long after they're finished. And at that point, we will have the world's first missile cruisers as well, which will make them a pretty fair upgrade on the San Franciscos rather than just a slight iteration. And also will render a lot of those larger but less modern cruiser fleets around the world pretty obsolete. Now, heavy cruisers, probably the category the U.S. is the most behind in, but I take some significant comfort in knowing that we're well ahead by miles in terms of battle cruisers, which, of course, are just the very heaviest of cruisers. Enough to make up for our tonnage deficit, to be clear. You'll notice if we add our heavy and light cruisers together, our heavy cruisers and battle cruisers together, that it amounts to, what, 368,000 tons? More, I believe, than any. No, Japan actually has us beat there. Japan really does have quite an impressive fleet. They're really only behind us on carriers, where they're quite a ways behind, it must be said. Which is interesting, because they were big early adopters, I think, in-game. And actually, to be fair, they have the second largest carrier fleet by numbers, but we'll get to that in a minute. Third largest, but still. Anyway, heavy cruisers. Spain. Spain has the smallest fleet in the world, well, out of the major, 9 powers, that is, but nearly half of the entire tonnage of their fleet consists of 17 heavy cruisers, amounting to 265,000 tons. The second largest ship in their fleet is a heavy cruiser. They only have 1 capital ship. And I'm not even sure it's really that much better than their heavy cruisers. Oh, okay, they have carriers too. I didn't notice that, of course, because they're down here somewhere, but barely bigger than their heavy cruisers, though, so. Okay, the third largest ship in their fleet's a heavy cruiser. Third largest, technically fourth largest. All right, we're being pedantic. The original, well, still really the pride and joy of their heavy cruiser fleet, the 4 Reina Regentes from the late 20s. 20,000 tons, 31 knots, 12 10-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 14 5-inch and 6 4-inch purpose guns, 5.5-inch belt. What can we say other than these are actually light battle cruisers? And they will still pretty much shred most any other heavy cruiser in the game, or pretty close. It's just that they're so damn big and heavy that they're basically battle cruisers. And they will not stand up well against any real battle cruiser, even one with 12-inch guns, let alone modern ones with 16-plus-inch guns. So it's in a very awkward niche where it's so damned expensive and big that by the Spanish fleet standards, these are effectively capital ships, but they can't actually stand up against anybody else's capital ships. Let me put it this way. If Spain had a healthy and functional fleet of capital ships and then had those giant heavy cruisers, that might be one thing. However, they have one surface capital ship, which effectively means that these heavy cruisers are standing in for surface capital ships, and they will be obliterated in that role. So maybe they should have built two less of those and gone for an actual battle cruiser or a battleship or something, but then again, given what they built for a battleship in 1925, I'm not too convinced. Anyway, they followed that with Isabel II in 1938, which is much more conventional. 13,500 tons, 32 knots, 8 8-inch, 12 4-inch guns, thinly armored for a heavy cruiser, but reasonably armed. Not bad. Not great, but not bad. They followed that with Principe Alpha. Let me just see. What am I comparing to? 12 9-inch guns is the U.S. standard now. Memphis is still technically on here as a museum ship. Huh? 12 9-inch guns is the U.S. standard, just so I'm aware. They built four Principe Alfonsos, 13,300 tons, 32 knots, 10 8-inch guns in two triple, two twin turrets, 16 3-inch, 4.5-inch belt. To be fair, in every way, an upgrade on the Isabel II's, really, and for 200 tons less. Yes, smaller secondaries, but they'll be better against aircraft at least. And heavier main armament, heavier armor. I would say the Principe Alfonsos are not that bad, certainly not by Spanish standards. They then returned to their giant building program with four Inazares class heavy cruisers of 14,900 tons, 32 knots, 12 10-inch guns and four triple turrets, 16 5-inch, and a 3-inch belt. Well, the obvious issue with these is that they are pretty damn thinly armored for a cruiser with 12 10-inch guns. I mean, really, they're pretty damn comparable to the Reina Regentes, except with 2.5 inches less armor and no aircraft, which probably just makes them worse in every way. They're not faster. They're 5,000 tons lighter, which makes them much more reasonable, at least. So I wouldn't necessarily... The Inazares aren't such a disaster as the Reina Regentes, honestly. They're just still maybe not what Spain should be pouring all of its money into. And they then built four La Carolinas, 14,600 tons, 33 knots, 9 10-inch guns, three triple turrets, 16 3-inch, 5.5-inch belt. You know, I can at least admire that Spain clearly has a doctrine and plans to stick to it. I just don't quite know that I follow that doctrine. I don't know what they're planning to do in wartime with all these heavy cruisers exactly. I guess just commerce rating. It has to be commerce rating. But anybody with an actual battle cruiser will still destroy them. However, in Spain's defense, I guess, that idea has become less insane now that there's only eight. No, okay, there's counting buildings, 6, 7, 8, 11 battle cruisers in the entire world? And their most obvious opponents of Spain, Italy and Austria-Hungary, have one battle cruiser between them? That makes a commerce rating strategy with all those big heavy cruisers potentially pretty viable, especially as their obvious opponents in Italy and Austria-Hungary don't really have any battleships either. So now I start to think, in context, maybe all these giant heavy cruisers are actually a pretty damn potent surface fleet just because Italy and Austria-Hungary have gotten rid of all of their old surface ships without replacement. And as long as Spain holds on to these, these are sort of a real risk to carriers or anything, you know? So I don't know. My opinion's changed a little. I think Spain's fleet actually maybe is not such a badly planned one, really, potentially. I mean, I'd rather still just have like I'd probably take one good squadron of 4 battlecruisers over all 12 or whatever of those mini battlecruisers. I mean, I'd take 4 battlecruisers over all 12 of them, but maybe if it suits Spain, maybe. Now, Austria-Hungary, 21 heavy cruisers amounting to 298,000 tons. Not quite, not quite such a large percentage of their fleet as Spain's is, but pretty close. A lot of people spending a lot on heavy cruisers, and it is also true for Austria that their second largest surface, uh, traditional gun range ship is a heavy cruiser, with only one proper surface capital ship in operation. That's not a. I realize carriers are technically surface capital ships, but like, I'm sort of using that to refer to traditional gun range type ships. Anyway, 3 Kaiser Karl VI from the late 20s, 15,600 tons, 29 knots, 9 10-inch guns, 3 triple turrets, 14 5-inch, 6 4-inch, 4.5-inch belt. Definitely showing their age now, the Kaiser Karls, but I mean, it's still some big, heavy guns, to be sure. A little slow. Not as many guns as most of the modern ships will have. Armor's not bad. I wouldn't call these useless. But in fairness, most of those big Spanish cruisers will certainly beat them. And Spain's one of their more likely opponents, I would think. Then they built 5 Marburgs, which 13,500 tons, 29 knots, 8 9-inch, 12 5-inch, 8 4-inch, 4.5-inch belt. Well, these are showing their age even more because their armament is not heavy enough to. Well, it's laid out fine and everything. Nothing's wrong with these exactly. Just their armament is not necessarily heavy enough to compensate for their speed is kind of falling off a little. They're really rather. Well, I mean, the most modern American ships are heavier, but for only having 8 9-inch guns and 29 knots, these are pretty heavy. So I would say they're showing their age a little, yeah. Now, more recently, they've built 4 Budweis class in the late 30s. 14,400 tons, 32 knots, 12 10-inch guns, 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 4-inch belt. I mean, these are very much in the same line as the Spanish ships. I guess just in the Mediterranean, the heavy cruiser is pretty much the king of surface gun range capital ship at this point, which is certainly an interesting development given there's been no naval treaty or anything forcing that. They've just scrapped all their battleships and gone with increasingly giant heavy cruisers. Don't know why. Then 3 Carlsbads, 14,300 tons, 32 knots, 12 8-inch and 16 5-inch guns, 4-inch belt, 4 triple turrets. I'm actually not so impressed, but for being just 100 tons less than these Budweises, I'm not quite sure why they've dropped from 10 all the way to 8-inch guns. Same armor, same speed. I don't know what else they changed. Maybe the Carlsbads are much more suited for long range operations or something, but how 100 tons less gets you all the way down from 10-inch to 8-inch guns, I don't know, but it's a lot of combat capacity lost there. Then 2 Schwarzenbergs, which are smaller still, 12,900 tons, 32 knots, 10 8-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 16 3-inch, 4-inch belt. I mean, these are much more standard, sort of lighter, heavy cruisers with the 8-inch guns, but they're not bad. I can't say they're horrifically flawed. And then they built 4 Agers with 12 8-inch guns, 14,300 tons, 31 knots, 16 5-inch guns, 4.5-inch belt. Well, I would almost say at 14,000 tons, I would kind of want them to just go up to 9-inch guns at least or something. They don't have to force 10-inch guns, but a lot of heavy cruisers out there with more than 8-inch guns in this timeline. It's not the fastest either. Armor is fine, I would say. The Jaegers feel a little underarmed to me. Yeah, I have to say, I think. Not horrifically, but just a little. From Austria-Hungary, we move on to Italy, which has the second smallest force of heavy cruisers in the world at 13, amounting to 185,000 tons. Although they do actually also have a battle cruiser still, so there's that. They have the two Amalfis from the early 30s, 12,000 tons, 31 knots, 8 8-inch, 14 6-inch guns, 4.5-inch belt. Well, I don't love the heavy 6-inch armament. That will have been weird even at the time and won't have aged well because it won't be dual purpose, of course. I mean, it is definitely useful additional firepower against other light or even heavy cruisers, but I mean, all those 10-inch or even maybe probably 9-inch gun-armed heavy cruisers. I don't know. It is a lot of barrels. I mean, it's quite a lot of firepower. I'd still probably rather have like 12 9-inch or 10-inch guns or something, which I think you could probably fit in along with like a 4 or 5-inch secondary armament. So I'm not too convinced by these, but I'm not going to say they're awful. Then they built two San Marcos with 8 8-inch, 12 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 13,700 tons, 32 knots. Well, see, to be fair, for being 1,700 tons heavier, I'm not sure how they managed to lose the heavy secondary armament entirely, along with half an inch of belt armor. Obviously, they did something rather differently, but 1 knot faster? Yeah, I don't know what they did differently, other than to make it worse, but doesn't seem to have turned out well. Then 3 San Justos, which are just 200 tons lighter and otherwise pretty much the same, so maybe just better tech. 4 Fiumes, which 13,400 tons, 33 knots, 9 8-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 16 3-inch, 4-inch belt. Bit more modern of a gun layout. Quite fast. Probably a little underarmed still. 8-inch is just not really the standard for heavy cruisers in this universe necessarily, although clearly it is for Italian heavy cruisers, but not for the world at large. But not terrible. I mean, they'll definitely this heavy cruiser force will definitely struggle against their Spanish or Austro-Hungarian counterparts, to be honest. Considering they have so many 10-inch guns, but it's probably a lot more versus. I would have preferred this while they all had large capital ship forces, but now that they're all mostly focusing on heavy cruisers for surface engagements, I'm not so convinced by it, you know? And then 2 Carlo Albertos, 13,200 tons, 31 knots, 10 8-inch guns in 2 triple, 2 twin turrets, 16 3-inch, 4.5-inch belt. Nothing wrong with these at all, just the 8-inch thing is probably hurting Italy in the current situation, really, realistically. And then that brings us to Russia, which has the largest force of heavy cruisers in the world, bar none, at 21 vessels amounting to 316,000 tons. They have the 3 old quote-unquote Nikolaevs from the early 30s, 12,900 tons, 30 knots, 6 10-inch guns, 14 6-inch, 8 4-inch, and a 4-inch belt. Obviously, those 10-inch guns are going to hit hard. That's a very heavy secondary armament. It's quite a formidable heavy cruiser. The mixed armament is still kind of weird. She's not especially fast or heavily armored. I wouldn't bet on her against one of mine with 12 9-inch guns. I think one of mine with 12 9-inch guns would win comfortably, in fact. But for the time, I don't know. It's not terrible, really. I mean, it will still destroy a lot of. All those Italian cruisers probably would lose to this. Then they have just Maxim Gorky, which I can't see right now because she's rebuilding. I'm pretty sure she's quite similar to the three Molotovs at 12 10-inch guns in 4 triple turrets and 16 dual-purpose 5-inch guns. 31 knots, 4-inch belt. I mean, these are sort of, from what I remember from the last special, pretty much the archetypal Russian, you know, very heavy cruisers, as it were, with just a big gunnery broadside for sure. Not the fastest, not exceptionally well armored, although decently. But that 12 10-inch guns, that's a big broadside and no mistake for a heavy cruiser. Obviously won't stand up against a battle cruiser, but I do have bigger heavy cruisers with less gunnery, so they're not exactly doing badly here with the Molotovs, to be sure. On the other hand, they weirdly reversed that with the Azovs, which are 14,500 tons, 33 knots, 9 8-inch guns only, and 4 twin turrets. No, 3 triple turrets, sorry. 16 3-inch dual purpose, 4-inch belt. I mean, much faster, but also substantially less well armed, and for 300 tons more, which I don't feel like can possibly be a good trade-off. Then they built no less than 6 Vladivostok class ships at 14,200 tons, 31 knots, 12 8-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch, 4.5-inch belt. A little slow, but well armored. Quite a heavy 8-inch gun armament. Slightly weird to revert to that after building all those ships with 10-inch guns, but the only thing I can think is that maybe the ships with 10-inch guns have, like, short range or are really cramped or something. Because it's a lot of guns to cramp onto that kind of displacement. Especially when they then build ships with the same displacement with way less guns and no other obvious compromises. Anyway, 4 Admiral Makarovs followed, which are back into the Molotov vein, albeit 1,000 tons heavier. And they make 32 knots, only a 3-inch belt, but 12 10-inch guns and 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose. I'm not sure what the changes are exactly to make them 1,000 tons heavier. In all ways that count, they're basically a Molotov, but 1 knot faster with an inch less of belt armor. There could be some other changes, though. Maybe more deck armor or something. Or better range or something like that, too. Most recently, they've built 2 Vasily Chapaevs, which have 9 10-inch guns and 3 triple turrets at 14,900 tons, 32 knots, 16 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 6-inch belt. So more like a standard speed, quite well armored, not as overwhelmingly well armed, but still very competitive with all the other big heavy cruisers out there. Just 1 turret less. So I would say the Vasily Chapaevs, I mean, overall the Russian fleet pretty good, but it's a weird mix of these huge 10-inch gunships and then some 8-inch gunships, which are less overwhelmingly impressive, especially at the same tonnage. Now, Britain has 19 heavy cruisers amounting to 242,000 tons, which honestly is pretty far down for their theoretical naval place in the world, but their naval place in the world has suffered a lot lately, yeah. Now, this force actually averages quite old. In fact, they have only really only about a third of them built in the last decade, and nearly another third built over 2 decades ago, with the Amphitrite sailing from the late 1920s. 13,200 tons, 30 knots, 6 10-inch guns, 14 6-inch guns, 6-inch belt. I mean, 6 4-inch dual purpose. I mean, well armored. Armament really still stands up all right today, although it's possible the quality of the guns is worse than modern ones would be. But rather slow. And the divided armament is not so impressive. I do think my modern cruisers would beat the Amphitrite, although it would probably not be one-sided. It's pretty solid cruiser design still. They followed that with 3 Creasy class, 10,800 tons, 29 knots, 8 9-inch guns, and 4 twin turrets, 16 4-inch dual purpose, and a 3-inch belt. Rather slow and thinly armored. Armament was good at the time, but is not exceptional now, so I would say the Creasy's have aged a fair bit worse than the Amphitrites. The Leviathans are basically returned to the Amphitrite design. 28 knots, 5-inch belt means, well, they age rather worse. The Leviathans are really quite slow and are actually only barely faster than the most modern types of battleships and so on. So that's a problem for them. Also, the armor is still good, but not as good. So overall, to be fair, they saved 400 tons compared to the Amphitrites, but I doubt it was worth it for 2 knots of speed. Then the one-off HMS Bedford. This is like the most bog standard heavy cruiser to ever exist. Feels like it was built to a treaty. 10,000 tons, 30 knots, 8 8-inch guns, 16 4-inch dual-purpose guns, and a 4-inch armor belt. It just incredibly standard all the way around. And actually, in this world, just incredibly below average all the way around, because most of the heavy cruisers out there are pushing like 15,000, 14,000 tons or something and have 9 or 10-inch guns or more 8-inch guns or something, including a lot of Britons for that matter, such as the 2 Hampshires at 13,900 tons, 31 knots, 9 10-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 16 4-inch, and a 3.5-inch belt. A pretty formidable ship overall. Not super well armored, not super fast, but a good armament and no really glaring flaws. Then they built Donegal, which appears to be pretty much the same, although she's rebuilding, but... Oh, I can see anyway. I don't even see... Oh, I guess a little more armor than the... Oh, a lot more armor than the Hampshires, in fact. Impressively more for the same displacement only 5 years later. I'm not sure how they pulled that off, really, even. Oh, not slower, too, though. Then they've taken a step back in the small direction with the 4 Berwicks, which 13,600 tons, 31 knots, 8 8-inch guns, 12 4-inch guns, 4-inch belt. I'm not sure how for 300 tons less they dropped a gun and the gun caliber by 2 inches and some secondaries. And they're not even faster. And they are slightly more heavily armored, though. That's a lot of firepower to lose for 300 tons less. I have to assume some other changes were done under the hood to give the Berwicks longer range or something, but seems like a big loss by comparison. And they then built 2 Roxburghs, which look to be very similar to the Berwicks, but are maybe a little better of a compromise in terms of they managed to shed another 500 tons in exchange for gaining 2 dual-purpose 4-inch guns and half an inch of belt armor. Albeit, no, same speed, too, so the Roxburghs are a little more reasonable in economy compromise, if that's what they're trying to do. Then we have France clocking in at 21 heavy cruisers, amounting to 280,000 tons. Third largest fleet in the world, with, no, fourth, actually. Russia's biggest, then Japan, and then Austria-Hungary is actually third. The oldest is Amiral Scharner from the late 20s. 11,100 tons, 30 knots, 8 8-inch guns, 16 4-inch dual purpose, 4 twin turrets, 4.5-inch belt. Quite standard. I mean, just in the modern era, a little slow. And the firepower is just below average, but not horrible, obviously. They then built 5 Bruys in the early 30s, which 12,000 tons, 30 knots, 8 8-inch guns, 14 6-inch guns, 5.5-inch belt. Slower than is the modern standard, but not too much so. Um, Good armor. Quite a heavy armament, really, when you factor the 6-inch guns in. Obviously, those will be a little more useful against like light cruisers or destroyers than they will be against other heavy cruisers, but they're not useless even against other heavy cruisers. The net effect is certainly worth at least 12 8-inch guns, if not like 15 or something even. Although those 6-inch guns aren't as well laid out either, so probably only really like 12. I don't hate it or anything. You could probably have done better by indeed just going for more 8-inch guns, but they made a choice. Um, then 5 Klebers, which drop the 6-inch guns for 4-inch dual purpose guns. 8-inch guns and 4 twin turrets still. Half an inch less of belt armor, but they actually get up to 32 knots, which I appreciate. I'm not actually sure it is worth losing all those 6-inch secondaries, to be honest, but the only thing objectionable about the Klebers is that their their armament at this point is just decidedly below average for the late 30s, really. They then appear to have compensated pretty hard by building 5 Sullies, which are monsters at 14,700 tons, 32 knots, 12 10-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch, 3.5-inch belt. Armor isn't so impressive. Speed, however, is good. Armament is great. I mean, overall, very formidable heavy cruiser for sure. No question about it. Wouldn't want to run into the Sullies in a dark alley. Probably stands up against any of the 10-inch cruisers anybody else has, more or less. They then built Colbert, a one-off. 14,700 tons, 30 knots, 12 8-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch, 3.5-inch belt. I mean, a little slow again, but at least a pretty good amount of firepower. Not the greatest armor either. Well, the Colbert isn't bad. It's just, it is a little slow, and it's weird to go back down to 10-inch gun. I mean, when you compare it to the ship built, well, some of them as much as 5 years earlier on the same tonnage, I don't quite understand. I mean, there are a lot of factors we don't see, such as range and freeboard and all of that. Maybe the Sullies really suffer on some of that in order to get all those guns onto that tonnage. I feel they almost must, because my tech is as good or better than France's, and I don't think I could shove that many guns onto that tonnage without a lot of compromises. But it's impossible to be sure. Anyway, most recently they've built 4 Edgar Quiné's, 13,100 tons, 31 knots, 8 9-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 12 5-inch, and a 4-inch belt. Pretty bog standard, really. Just kind of a little, below average speed, average to below average guns, average to below average armor. There's nothing wrong with Edgar Quinet class. It's just unimpressive, I would say. Nothing really stands out about it. So then after France, we go to Germany, which has 19 heavy cruisers, amounting to 259,000 tons. And they actually have a lot of capital ships too still. Good for them. The oldest of those is Veneta from the late 20s, 11,000 tons, 29 knots, 8 9-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 16 4-inch dual purpose, 3.5-inch belt. I mean, this was a good cruiser at the time she was built, but is now showing her age in terms of, slower than the modern standard, not that well armored, reasonably armed, but definitely not brilliantly armed for the modern era. Just a bit small and old in every way, but still not horrible. Then 4 Stuttgart class from the early 30s. These are pretty big. 15,100 tons, 30 knots, 9 10-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets. 14 5-inch, 12 4-inch all dual purpose, 5-inch belt. Well armored, pretty heavily armed, but maybe just a little bit, a couple years early, because obviously all those 12 10-inch gun ships, some of which are lighter, will probably beat her in a fight. She does have a very impressive dual purpose armament, but she's also just a little slow, even if she is well armored. So there's nothing horribly wrong with the Stuttgarts, but I'm not very impressed by them compared to a lot of the other 10-inch cruisers out there. They built 4 of those, and then also 2 Rostocks, which drop the 5-inch guns down to 3-inch dual purpose, and in return get a knot of speed and half an inch of belt armor, which is maybe worth it. It's worth it if you're picturing fighting aircraft off with those guns. Not worth it if you're picturing fighting off destroyers with those guns, I would say. Overall, pretty equivalent. And then they built 5 Regensburgs, 13,200 tons, 32 knots, 8 8-inch, and 12 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 4-inch belt. Not bad. Not bad at all. Well, I mean, good speed, reasonable armor. The armament is where she's let down. It's obviously standard for OTL. That is real life heavy cruisers. Not so great for this timeline. Then the Erfurts, which 5 of those built in the early 40s, appear to be pretty much the same. I don't even really obviously see anything that's different from the Regensburgs, honestly. Allegedly something's different, but basically the same class again. Then very recently they've built the 2 Scharnhorsts, which are pretty big ships again. 14,000 tons, 32 knots, 9 10-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 16 4-inch dual-purpose, 5.5-inch belt. Obviously, they don't have the 12 10-inch guns that some of the very most powerful have. But then again, they do have a lot of armor. Their speed is very good. Yeah, the Scharnhorsts are quite nice, I would say. They're pretty solid. And so then that takes us on to Japan, which has 20 heavy cruisers amounting to 309,500 tons. Just shy of Russia. And probably a little more shy, as 3 of those are actually under construction still for Japan to reach that total tonnage. But a lot of heavy cruisers, and they have a lot more capital ships still in service than Russia does, too. The oldest is Yakumo from the mid-20s, 10,700 tons, 30 knots, 8 8-inch guns, 16 4-inch, 4.5-inch belt. Not terrible, but definitely a little bit obsolete. Just speed, not bad, but not great for the modern era. Armor, good, but not exceptional. Armament, just a little behind. Honestly, still a good cruiser, but not a great cruiser. Obviously, on the small and cheap side, though, which is good for her capabilities. They followed that with the 3 Kako class, which are, monsters at 15,000 tons, 9 10-inch guns, 3 triple turrets, 14 5-inch, 6 4-inch, 5-inch belt. All of that's very nice. The fact that she only makes 27 knots makes this class fairly obsolete, actually, because it's really going to have trouble outpacing modern battleships and will never catch any modern cruiser, so the Kako class is actually aged rather poorly, I would say. Armament and armor are still fine, but the speed is not. Really, not at all for a modern cruiser, so. Then 2 Takaos, 10,200 tons, 30 knots, 8 8-inch guns, and 4 twin turrets, 16 4-inch, dual-purpose, 4-inch belt. Quite bog standard, very similar to the Yakumos. Not horrible, but just not great. Probably, honestly, then or now. They then upgraded with the 6 Haguros, which have 10 8-inch guns in 2 twin and 2 triple turrets, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 32 knots, 4.5-inch belt. Probably, well, heavier, I think, right? Yeah, a fair bit heavier. To the point that you would have almost maybe wanted more at adding 3,000 tons, but extra 8-inch guns for more gives a bit of an edge in firepower. The 3-inch guns will be probably better against aircraft, although not necessarily against against small ships. Armor is better. Speed is much more like the modern standard. So the Haguro's quite a nice class, I would say. Not world beaters, but nice. And they eventually upgraded that with 2 Suzuyas, which 13,900 tons, 31 knots, 12 8-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 4.5-inch belt. Well, compared to the Haguros, a knot slower, but gains a much heavier secondary armament for probably mainly anti-destroyer work, and actually has 4 triple turrets instead of a mixed armament. So overall, I mean, this is what I would build out of the two. The Haguros might be better against aircraft marginally, but the Suzuyas will definitely be better against destroyers and other surface ships. Then 5 Kumano class from the mid 40s into the late 40s. 13,100 tons, 32 knots, 8 8-inch guns, 12 4-inch dual purpose, 4-inch belt. I mean, speed is good, armor is alright. Honestly, for a 13,000 ton ship, 8 8-inch guns in this world where there's so many 9 and 10-inch gun heavy cruisers around, not spectacular, really. Most recently, they've built a bit of a monstrosity with Neba, head of a class of 3 by the look of it. 14,800 tons, 31 knots, 12 10-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, and a 4-inch belt. A little below that sort of target speed, but not bad at all. Armor is good. Armament is very heavy. Neba is definitely formidable. And they're building a 15,900 ton Furitaka as well. Now, against all this, the U.S. actually has one of the smallest heavy cruiser forces, in fact, the smallest heavy cruiser force in the world, at 10 ships amounting to 163,000 tons, and no immediate plans for replacement either. All 10 of the ships in active service are of the Charlotte class, built in the 41 to 46 window. 16,300 tons, 32 knots, 12 9-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch guns in dual purpose mounts, 5-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. Look, the Charlotte class, well, there's just not enough of them to compete with some of the navies around the world, and they're very heavy, to be honest, for what they offer. But I'm going to maintain 12 9-inch guns. The only thing out there that beats them is some of those 12 10-inch gun ships. And a very great number of those made some significant compromises in either speed or armor. So the Charlottes can just about stand toe-to-toe with pretty much anything out there. In terms of heavy cruisers, I would say they're still quite solid. They're not some ancient design or anything. But they are definitely not as numerous as some of the other world power ships out there. Armor is good, obviously, as is speed. Armament, I mean, any of those 8-inch gun ships shall beat those for sure. And the 9, 10-inch gun ships, pretty much a wash. I don't think the Charlottes are an exceptionally good design, but I don't think they're a bad design either. I think they'll probably need replacement sooner than later, relatively speaking, but they're not super high on the priority list, obviously, compared to destroyers and light cruisers just at the moment. And so that brings us into the big ships, the carriers, and the surface capital ships. I believe up to this point I've always done the surface capital ships last, but it's 1950. We're going to swap that around and do the carriers last. So Spain, Spain has exactly one major surface capital ship left. One gun capital ship left, that is. That would be the 1925 battleship San Francisco de Paula. 27,600 tons, 23 knots, 9 13-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 16 5-inch and 4 3-inch dual purpose, and a 12.5-inch belt. Look, this ship was hopelessly obsolete when completed in 1925. In 1950, this is this is target practice for any other battleship that still exists. I'm pretty sure literally any other battleship that still exists. It is probably worse than useless. This may be an active liability for the Spanish fleet, despite being its largest ship. And yes, it is still its largest ship, although these new carriers will just exceed it by 100 tons when finished. They probably should have scrapped it and built more really big cruisers at some point. It's horrible. Yeah. That's all I gotta say about that. Especially as their closest rivals, Italy and Austria-Hungary, have kept at least somewhat more potent forces. Austria-Hungary also only has one big gunship in service, but that is the dreadnought Slavonian, 35,900 tons, 25 knots, 10 16-inch guns in 2 twin, 2 triple turrets, 14 6-inch, 6 4-inch, 12-inch belt. Technically slightly less armor, but a hugely superior armament and faster to boot. Slavonian would make absolute mincemeat of the Spanish dreadnought, and really, I mean, quite fast. Not spectacularly armored, but not terribly either. Slavonian is still quite a formidable ship, especially for her tonnage, even to this day. Not bad at all. Then Italy has kept one battle cruiser and one battleship. The battle cruiser being the 37,300 ton Regina Elena, 28 knots, 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 14 6-inch and 8 4-inch guns, and a 12-inch belt. With a 12-inch belt, basically amounts to almost a fast battleship. Not the most spectacularly armed, considering how many ships have 16-inch or even more guns in this world, but not horribly. There's no fundamental major issue with the Regina Elena. It's just that she's a bit old. Her armament could be better. Her speed could definitely be better. I mean, she's 23 years old. She could definitely use a replacement. Especially against, say, Julio Caesar, which is a knot slower. But she's not useless. Certainly not in the Mediterranean environment. The pride of Italy's fleet is the Julio Caesar, 38,600 tons, 27 knots, 10 to 16-inch guns, 14 6-inch, 12 4-inch, 12-inch belt. I mean, compared to the to the Regina Elena, same armor, 1 knot slower, and for that goes from 8 15-inch to 10 16-inch guns, so, and 1,300 tons of displacement. But, I mean, Julio Caesar is pretty much just straight up a better ship. Compared to her, Regina Elena doesn't even really match the battleship description, considering she's, or battle cruiser description, considering she's only a knot faster. And that's her fundamental flaw as a modern battle cruiser. She's just too slow for the job as a battle cruiser. But she's got thick enough armor that she can still be basically a second-line battleship, so not useless. The Italian ships are not that bad. There's just literally only 2 of them. Then Russia has 3 major gun units still in service. The battle cruiser Chesma of the Rimnik class is the oldest. 42,700 tons, 30 knots, 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 14 4-inch and 6 3-inch dual purpose, 12.5-inch belt. Look, this ship was exceptionally formidable when completed. It fought us once and survived. unlike her sisters, which I believe didn't survive that war. She's still well armed, pretty well armed, yeah. She's still pretty fast, not the fastest, but pretty fast. She's still reasonably well armored, although I'm guessing her deck suffers a little. Chesma is really not that obsolete. She's still quite a dangerous combat unit, even in 1950, on the surface, in gun range. Then they have two battleships. Marat is a more classical old battleship, 36,900 tons, 23 knots, nine 16-inch guns and three triple turrets, 14 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 13.5-inch belt. Quite well armored, fairly well armed, reasonable speed. However, she is a bit put to shame by Sverdlov, which 44,000. Well, okay, Sverdlov is weird as hell, to be fair. 44,200 tons, 31 knots, eight 17-inch guns in two forward quadruple turrets, 16 5-inch, 10 3-inch, 12.5-inch belt. I mean, she's very fast, faster even than Chesma. And the eight 17-inch guns are probably about equivalent to nine 16-inch guns, really. Maybe it's even a little more. Armor is worse, though. Honestly, well, I mean, you'd probably take Sverdlov just for her speed, but she's a weird design, and I'm not in love with her. The two quad turrets is very strange, yeah. Britain has five major gun units still in service, with four, with one building actually, which is a rarity. The oldest of their four battleships is Collingwood, 33,400 tons, 24 knots, nine 16-inch guns, three triple turrets, 16 5-inch, four 3-inch, 13.5-inch belt. Look, the layout of the turrets is a bit dumb, but I don't think it affects anything too much in game. Which means that overall, it's quite a solid battleship. Fast, well armored, fairly well armed. Obviously, just a little obsolete. There's definitely faster and heavier armed battleships out there now, but was not terrible at the time she was built, and still isn't horrific, I wouldn't say. There's only a relatively small number of hyper-modern battleships that would really tear her apart. Then from a couple years later, HMS Bulwark, 39,900 tons, 23 knots, nine 16-inch guns, three triple turrets all forward, 14 6-inch, 6 4-inch dual purpose, 15-inch belt. Not fast by modern standards, although not bad at the time she was built. Well armed, exceptionally well armored, basically a Nelson-like, and quite a nice ship, really, Bulwark. Fought us once and got bombed, but survived. Has been refit since then, apparently. Maybe with dual-purpose guns, not sure. Then their most modern ship to survive the war with us was HMS Albion, 38,600 tons, 24 knots, nine 16-inch guns all forward, 14 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 13-inch belt. I mean, she's a knot faster than Hood, but overall, for being built 7 years later, not impressive. Same armament, one knot faster, less armor, at least belt by a fair margin. Still not a bad battleship, but not spectacular. Now, Britain's latest thing, now 5 years old, is HMS Magnificent. 64,300 tons, 28 knots, 12 16-inch guns and four triple turrets, 25-inch and 8 3-inch dual purpose, and a 13-inch belt. Obviously a proper fast battleship, more or less. Very well armed all the way around. Solid armor. Magnificent is quite a dangerous ship. Not, in my opinion, spectacularly dangerous. Definitely outdone by the latest American battleships, but quite dangerous nonetheless. Would probably shred near anything from the preceding not fast battleship generation. And they are building, we don't know the details yet, but they are building a 44,700 ton battle cruiser HMS Indomitable. Which we know very little about. I mean, likely to be 16-inch gun armed. Obviously bigger than all their battleships except Magnificent, but quite a lot smaller than Magnificent still, so we'll see. Then France has two major gun units still in service, being Diderot of 1928, 39,700 tons, 23 knots, 9 16-inch guns, 3 triple turrets all forward, 14 6-inch, 6 3-inch, 12-inch belt. Basically their own Nelson look-alike, but without the really spectacular armor. So still a good ship, but not as great as the British Bulwark type. And then Democratie from 1932, 34,100 tons, 22 knots, 8 16-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 14 6-inch, 8 4-inch, 13.5-inch belt. Obviously slightly better armor than Diderot, but one less gun barrel, one knot less, and a lot less tonnage. Not actually an improvement, I wouldn't say. Although if that tonnage came on just tech improvement, that would be impressive. But I suspect she's also compromising something else, relatively speaking, probably. Anyway, so that brings us around to Germany, which has, I believe, just about, well, one of the largest fleets still in service anyway, with in all 6 battleships still in service and 2 new battle cruisers building. Their oldest battleship by a very substantial margin is Wetten of the Mecklenburg class, 29,100 tons, 26 knots, 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 6-inch, 4 4-inch dual purpose, 8.5-inch belt. To be honest, Wetten is pretty much a sitting duck in modern combat. Only 14-inch guns is really no longer enough, and her armor is abysmal, but her speed is fairly solid. It was very solid when she was built, if it was the same then, which I think it probably was. But sorry. Her armor is terrible, though, and her armament as well now, really, so no. Then we have Oldenburg from 1930. 43,600 tons, 27 knots, 8 16-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 14 6-inch, 8 4-inch, and a 12-inch belt. Solid armor, very impressive speed, solid armament. Overall, quite a good early fast battleship. For something built in 1930, quite an impressive early fast battleship. Then they have Bismarck from 1936. 39,600 tons, 25 knots, 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 14 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 13-inch belt. Fairly fast, especially for her time. Fairly well armored, fairly well armed. Nothing at all wrong with Bismarck. Quite a nice little battleship, or not so little battleship. Then the Sau, 38,700 tons, 26 knots, 10 16-inch guns in 2 twin, 2 triple turrets, 14 6-inch, 8 4-inch, and a 13-inch belt. Really nothing wrong with her either. In fact, compared to Bismarck, an extra gun barrel, an extra knot of speed, the same armor, and 900 tons lighter. So 1 year later, and pretty much a straight upgrade as far as I can tell. Then they have Hanover built. They have 2 very impressive battleships built in the last couple of years. Hanover of 1945, 44,000 tons, 31 knots, 8 17-inch guns and 2 quadruple forward turrets, 16 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 12.5-inch belt. Very fast, obviously, for a battleship. Pretty much equal to any battle cruiser. Or even just pretty much equal to cruisers of the modern era. Armor is decent. Armament, to be honest, a bit weird, but pretty much equal to what you get on most battleships, albeit there are some more heavily armed battleships, but 8 barrels and 17 inches, not bad at all. Probably, yeah, probably similar, maybe less firepower than Nassau, but not by much. However, they trumped that just 2 years later with the absolute monstrosity that is SMS Lothringen. 70,000 tons, 27 knots, 10 17-inch guns in two triple, two twin turrets, 14 6-inch, 16 4-inch guns, 12.5-inch belt, 6 aircraft. Still quite fast, if not as much of a true fast battleship as Hanover. Decent but not spectacular armor. But an extraordinarily heavy armament of 10 17-inch guns. I don't know if I've seen anything yet to beat that. Quite a dangerous ship, although for 70,000 tons, you almost expect more armor. But she might have like a 5-inch deck or something. Probably does, even. And they are building two 43,800-ton battle cruisers, Von der Tann and Hansa now, although we can't see the details yet. Now, Japan has, I believe, the second largest fleet of capital ships, gun capital ships still in service, with 8 battleships amounting to 376,000 tons. Plus, they're building 2 new battle cruisers. Their oldest of their battleships is Sagami from 1926, 33,700 tons, 23 knots, 9 15-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 16 5-inch, 4 3-inch, and 13-inch belt. Overall, definitely a dangerous battleship. Okay. All right. Sorry. Pretty fast for the time she was built. Not so fast now. Good armor. Armament, quite good at the time she was built, or fairly good at the time she was built. Not so spectacular now. So when I say she was a dangerous battleship, in 1926 she was a dangerous battleship. In 1950, she's definitely on the obsolete end of things, but not horrible. So still a viable combat unit, I would say. Just a little on the slow end for modern ships. Well, significantly on the slow end if she was built now, but at least she's not like 21 or less knots. They then Katori from 1930, 35,000 tons, 22 knots, 8 16-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 14 6-inch, 8 4-inch, and a 13-inch belt. Well, her armament is good. Her armor is good. Her speed is definitely on the slow side, even more than Sagami's, but it's not so bad as to, still definitely a useful part of the battle line. Then Suo from another 4 years later, for a good decade, the pride of the Japanese fleet. 48,200 tons, 30 knots, 10 16-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, 25-inch and 4 4-inch, 12.5-inch belt. Extremely fast, especially for when she was built. Well armored, reasonably, not spectacularly, but reasonably. Very heavy armament. Suo really is a monster of a battleship, to be sure, although the U.S. matches her, obviously, but very, very impressive battleship. And a couple of years later, they built Kawachi and Yashima, which I think are the first actual class still intact I've seen in all the AI here. 37,400 tons, 24 knots, 10 16-inch guns, 14 6-inch, 12 4-inch, and an 11.5-inch belt. Compared to Suo, 10,000 tons lighter. However, it mostly comes off in terms of loss of speed. Her armor's also a bit thinner, but her armament is the same, except for swapping the 5 inches for 6 inches, which is a weird choice for me. I wouldn't have done that, but look, those 6 knots are very, very helpful in modern combat. But the cost savings of a full 10,000 tons of weight, not to be laughed at either. And then very recently, they've built 3 monster battleships in the mid-40s. Tosa Has the most barrels and is the heaviest, I believe. Yep. The heaviest of them is Tosa, 66,400 tons, 26 knots, 11 17-inch guns in 2 quadruple and 1 triple turret, 25-inch, 10 3-inch, 14-inch armor belt. Armor, a speed good, but not spectacular. However, armor and armament both absolutely spectacular. Well, armor very good, armament spectacular. I think the heaviest out of any battleship we've seen, right? Germany had what, 10, 17? Yeah. I think this is the most heavily armed battleship afloat in 1950. And yeah, she's certainly a monster. For sure a monster. It's kind of a weird gunnery setup, but definitely a monstrous ship. Just slightly lighter, and almost as much, probably really the ship you'd take, but whatever. A slightly different take, Yamashiro, 64,900 tons, 30 knots, 9 18-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 14 6-inch and 23-inch guns and a 13-inch belt. Almost more like a battle cruiser, or in any case, a proper fast battleship. Belt is a little thinner, but still good, and probably her deck's very good. Speed is very impressive. Armament is very nice. 9 18-inch guns is going to hurt. Probably equivalent to 12 16-inch guns, maybe even superior. 18-inch guns are very large anyway. And then they cheaped out very slightly with Awa, which is still 52,700 tons, 28 knots, 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 16 5-inch, 16 3-inch, and a 15-inch belt. Still quite fast, if not extraordinarily. Extremely well armored. And a very respectable, if not earth-shattering armament. Overall, the Japanese fleet does run, battleship fleet does run the gamut from kind of obsolete to extremely modern, but they have at least none of their battleships are super dated, really. Even Sagami is outdated, but not hopelessly so. And they have 3 real super battleships in Tosa, Yamashiro, and Awa, and really in Suo as well. The U.S., however, does have the clear prize in terms of surface gun capital ships, with 8 battleships for 447,000 tons, more than Japan's 8, and 4 battle cruisers for 205,000 tons. Japan is building 2 Ikomas at 48,000 tons apiece, but not finished yet. The U.S. ships fall into just 4 total classes, actually. First of all, the 5 USS Pennsylvania, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, and Wyoming, built in the 33 to 36, 52,200 tons, 24 knots, 12 16-inch guns, 24 5-inch dual-purpose guns, a 14-inch belt, and a 5-inch deck. Faster than most of the ships that came before them. Not super fast by 1950 standards. In fact, slow enough that they're becoming a bit obsolete, but not hopeless. Still very well armed and very well armored, even by 1950 standards. There's still not really any battleship out there that I would say clear-cut beats the Pennsylvanias. Like the Japanese Tosa, I mean, is her armor... The Japanese Tosa probably does beat the Pennsylvanias, depending on what her deck armor is, but not by like a crushing margin. Probably similar armor. 12 16-inch guns versus 11 17-inch is probably just in Tosa's favor, and Tosa's a bit faster, but it's not really a huge advantage to the likes of Tosa for an extra 14,000 tons either. And then more recently, the U.S. has built USS Vermont, Alabama, and Ohio just in 1947-48. And these are the current U.S. last word in battleships. 62,100 tons, 27 knots, 12 16-inch guns and 4 triple turrets, 24 5-inch dual purpose, absolutely piled on AA. 14-inch belt, 6-inch deck. These are obviously the more directly comparable in modernity and size to Tosa, although still 4,000 tons lighter. In terms of armament, pretty much a toss-up, maybe just in favor of Tosa. I suspect the Vermonts are maybe have even more deck armor, or at least as much, and are not faster. Um, Overall, I would call Vermont versus Atosa pretty much a wash. And I do believe the U.S. battleship fleet beats the Japanese fleet hands down overall because our three super battleships versus their three is probably a wash or maybe a bit in our favor given Awa is not quite as crazy. And then their other five do not really quite stand up to the Pennsylvanias. Aside from that, we have four battle cruisers. The USS United States and Essex from 1938, 46,000 tons, 32 knots, still very competitive. 9 16-inch guns, 3 triple turrets, all forward, 24 5-inch dual purpose, 12-inch belt, 4-inch deck. Obviously not quite as well armored as the battleships, but still pretty well armored. Well armed, and very fast. These are pretty much our solution to all those heavy cruisers everybody else has been building. These will slaughter those heavy cruisers everybody else has been building by the truckload with absolute ease, more or less. And honestly, they're still competitive against a large percentage of the total battleships that are still around. And at 32 knots are fast enough to present a very credible threat to fleet carriers if they get the drop on them. Now, just a year ago, we completed USS Oriskany and Valley Forge of our latest battlecruiser class. These are even more terrifying. 56,300 tons, 32 knots, 12 16-inch guns, and 4 quadruple turrets all forward, 25-inch dual purpose, piles of AA, 12-inch belt, 5-inch deck. I have a high degree of confidence that the Oriskany class are the most powerful battle cruisers in service anywhere in the world. The Vermonts are probably a toss-up with like the Tosa or Yamashiro, or with the German Lothringen. Although they're better armored, I would say, almost certainly. So I'm not so. Although Lothringen's the biggest battleship in the world, so I don't know how she only has a 12.5-inch belt. I think that they probably straight up beat the Magnificent, to be honest, although not by a huge margin. But Oriskany almost has no competition in modern battle cruisers, although a lot of people are building them now to compete with the Oriskanys. We'll see if any of them turn out to actually be better. Most of them are not quite at the same tonnage, so I doubt it. Overall, the U.S. gun capital fleet, 12 ships, definitely still the strongest in the world. Japan and Germany are the closest to putting up a fight, but definitely very clear cut our gun line is the strongest in the world at this point. Right. Sorry, folks. Little gap there. You may have noticed it's the next day for me now. But anyway, we continue with the carriers of the world. It being 1950, these are pretty much now the premier kings of the ocean, as it were. Now, Spain, being backwards and pitiful, has a total of 4 light carriers amounting to 61,000 tons and 2 fleet carriers for 99,000 tons, albeit they do have plans in the works to double that. Their current carrier force amounts to 3 Miguel de Cervantes class light carriers built in the early 30s, which 11,500 tons make 27 knots and apparently carry 31 aircraft. I'm guessing those are not jet aircraft, so not exactly the most modern things in the world, Their value slightly dubious in the modern era, but something. And then two Alfonso the 12th class fleet carriers built in the mid 30s, 21,800 tons, 30 knots, 16 5-inch guns, apparently not dual purpose. Now, I do notice one of them carries 38 aircraft, and the other one apparently carries 61, which suggests that they've converted Alfonso the 13th. Or, no, sorry, they've converted Alfonso the 12th to jet operations, while Alfonso the 13th is still only fitted out for piston operations. So, functionally, they have one jet ready carrier, Alfonso the 12th, and the rest is piston equipped. And you know what? Actually, no. I didn't catch that before, but 3 out of their 4 light carriers have also presumably been refitted for jet operations and only carry 14 aircraft apiece in that configuration. So, if we were to take a look at, let's see, 14 by. Calculator here, because math. What the hell did I just do? This is teach me to talk while I'm calculating. 172 total aircraft they have actually on ships. That is a pretty high percentage of their total, but it's obviously not a lot. I have about 2 of my carriers will carry that many almost. That said, it's a lot better than real life Spain was doing, so there's that. Nothing is fundamentally exactly wrong with the carriers, except that they're all rather old. Even the largest of them is not that large, and converting these things to jet operations is pretty hopeless, but I mean, honestly, I'd probably, especially in 1950, I'd probably rather have just double the number of piston aircraft and, like, what is 14 jet aircraft really going to do for you? I don't know. Anyway, Austria-Hungary manages to have 5 fleet carriers, albeit at the cost of having 0. Okay, I will say Spain is building 2 Trio-class carriers at 28,000 tons, more or less, which should be quite a bit more capable and probably will be natively designed for jet operations. So there's that. Now, Austria-Hungary has 5 fleet carriers in service and is building one more. The oldest 2 are Prague and Krakow from the early 30s, 20,600 tons, 30 knots, 16 5-inch guns, 12 3-inch dual purpose, carry 65 aircraft. I'm going to go ahead and assume that's not jets, but it's a pretty good number of aircraft. Then from slightly later in the 30s, they have Graz, which is 21,300 tons, 30 knots, 16 5-inch guns, 42 aircraft. Given that she's larger, that actually might be jets. That or she's just very well armored. And most recently, they've built Debrecen and Szeged, which at 40,100 tons, 28 knots, 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, a 3-inch armor belt, carry 65 aircraft, and at 40,000 tons, let me compare to my own just to be sure, but yeah, I would say at 40,000 tons, those are probably jet capable, which means that the Debrecens are quite impressive. I mean, that's 130 aircraft. That's another 130, albeit probably piston. So that's 260, 302, 302 aircraft they can operate, and almost 200 of them are actually jets. So Austria has a much more formidable carrier force, and particularly these Debrecens are actually some of the more powerful carriers afloat at this moment, I think. Now, Italy clocks in at 6 fleet carriers, 7 light carriers, amounting to 210,000 and 89,000 tons, respectively. which actually puts them fourth in fleet carriers in the world. Quite an impressive force, especially for a Mediterranean-bound country. Now, four of those are okay. No, one of those is Astore from the late 20s, 17,000 tons, 28 knots, 16 5-inch guns. She carries only 27 aircraft. Either she has been converted to jets, or she's just a bad conversion or very early carrier. Hard to be sure. The game doesn't really label it in any particular way. Then three Aquilas from the late 30s, 18,300 tons, 27 knots, 16 5-inch guns, 37 aircraft each, of course. Again, it's hard to say if she's been. I would almost say at that tonnage for that many aircraft, they might have been converted. Probably not. Well, in any case, it's very hard to say. But they're reasonably sized. I mean, small carriers, to be sure. In either way, small carriers. Then they have the two Griffons from the early 40s. Griffon, 22,000. Well, they're both 22,200 tons, 28 knots, 8 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 50 aircraft. A little slow for carriers. I note this one has 50 aircraft and this one has 76, so clearly one has been converted to jet operations and not Falcon, but they're still doing all right in that regard. Overall, it amounts to 76, 50, 27, 264 aircraft, which is not too shabby. Oh, but I forgot to include the light carriers. They do have two Sirio class from the early 30s, which 13,200 tons, 30 knots, carry 15 aircraft, which I'm going to assume are jets. So that's another 30. The very similar 12,900 ton Vega, which also carries 15 aircraft, and so is pretty much functionally identical, but it's less armor. Two Sagittarios from the late 30s, which 14,200 tons, 30 knots, 6 5-inch guns, 13 aircraft only. And two Antares class from the early 40s, 10,700 tons, 31 knots, 4 5-inch and 12 4-inch dual purpose, and 14 aircraft. So that adds another, 45, 75, just about 100 more aircraft to the Italian Air Force overall. Coupled with the 264 they already had, I mean, that's about 360-ish. I mean, the fundamental problem I have with them is that they don't have any. Quite a few of them are a little on the slow side. Only 27 knots or so for many of them. And none of them are very large. Even their newest existing carriers are only 22,000 tons, although to be fair, they carried plenty of piston aircraft, but they're not going to be spectacular in the jet age. I do note, however, they're building a pair of 47,000-ton Condor class, so that might rectify that issue a little. Russia. Russia has 4 fleet carriers amounting to 133,000 tons and 6 light carriers amounting to 70,000 tons, which honestly puts them well behind the trend, it must be said. They have 2 Kazan-class carriers from the very early 30s, 17,900 tons, 28 knots, 16 5-inch guns, not dual-purpose, 54 aircraft apiece, although Baku has clearly been converted to jet operations with 32 aircraft. And then from the late 30s, they have the two 29,000-ton Leningrads, 29 knots, 16 5-inch guns. This one carries 58 aircraft, but is jet. Gorky carries 86 non-jet aircraft. So we've kind of caught them midway through their conversion process here, as with many. And ourselves, for that matter, I believe. They're also building the 39,000-ton Novosibirsk. But for now, they really only have 4 carriers, all built in the 30s. None of them are going to be spectacularly large or well equipped for jet operations, although none of them are hopelessly flawed either. Then they have three Zijigulis from 1930, 10,500 tons, 28 knots, 30 aircraft. Well, but then the other two only carry 13. I really question the value of converting these light carriers to jet operations. They carry so few aircraft that their actual combat value is going to be questionable at that point. There certainly wouldn't be much of it. I mean, they're basically like escort carrier sized at that point. But that's not really a valuable thing in games so far as I've ever seen. Then they have Yake, 10,800 tons, 28 knots, 14 aircraft, pretty much fundamentally similar. And from the 40s, they have the 13,000 ton, 30 knot Donets, which carries 32 aircraft, but probably not jets. And the 15,100 ton, 27 knot, 29 aircraft Chelyabinsk, which I'm going to assume also not jets, probably. Although maybe a modern carrier built to that tonnage could just squeeze that many jets on, because, well, the 18,000 ton Kazan gets 32, better tech, 20 years later tech. Maybe these are jets on Chelyabinsk, maybe. In any case, that's the extent of the Russian fleet. It's not very large. It has to be said, only 4 fleet carriers is definitely behind the trend when Italy has 6. Now, Great Britain has a pretty formidable carrier fleet still, definitely doing better than some other parts of its fleet. 5 fleet carriers amounting to 291,000 tons puts them third in the world. Well, 3 more building is included in that, though. And 8 light carriers amounting to 98,000 tons. Their existing surviving fleet carriers post-war would be HMS Argus from 1928, 18,600 tons, 26 knots, 16 5-inch guns, 32 aircraft. Might have been converted to jet operations already, yeah. And Glorious from 1933, 19,800 tons, 30 knots, 16 4-inch guns, 34 aircraft, probably also converted to jet operations. 66 aircraft between them, not spectacular though, those are both small carriers. Now, they do have, from the late 30s to 40, HMS Hermes and Formidable, 37,400 tons, 30 knots, 16 4-inch guns, built to carry 101 aircraft, and based on this conversion can carry 70, even with jets. And just recently they finished Ark Royal last year, only 31,900 tons. Her speed is not going to be actually 18 knots, but it's hard to say what it really is. 60 aircraft, and those probably are jets. So overall, they're going to have about, 266 jet aircraft from their fleet carriers. Now, the real rub is that they're building, due in 2 years, HMS Furious, Illustrious, and Implacable, all at 49,000 tons, and those are going to be quite something. Now, for light carriers, they have 2 Dashers, Dasher and Charger, 13,900 tons, 30 knots, 6 5-inch guns, 30 aircraft originally, 13 after jet conversion. Battler, which is bigger, but otherwise functionally pretty much identical. Not sure how that extra 1,700 tons doesn't seem to have really bought them anything, but I'm going to assume that that means the Dashers are short-ranged or something weird. Then 2 10,600 ton Audacities, 28 knots, 6 5-inch guns, 14 aircraft apiece, certainly converted to jets, but still. And then Pursuer, Stalker, and Khedive from the mid-40s, 11,000 tons, 30 knots, 8 5-inch guns, 15 aircraft. I mean, they're fine. Pretty much all the AI light carrier designs are fine as light carriers. Like, they're not broken. It's just that for myself, I really question the value of light jet carriers if you're a nation that can afford any reasonable number of fleet jet carriers, if you know what I'm saying. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, it's better to have air cover than not, but there's a reason the major naval powers mostly only operate light carriers with helicopters or VTOL aircraft and don't try to just cram like a dozen of them onto tiny little pocket carriers these days. Not that it's unheard of, but mostly it's smaller or very budget conscious countries. Obviously, the US has dedicated amphibious assault ships, but those are mostly focused on direct, like, land combat support, and they carry a lot of helicopters and such instead of trying to be tiny carriers, which is what these are. Now that brings us to France, which has 9 carriers, fleet carriers, and 5 light carriers in service, 318,000 tons of fleet carriers, counting the one building, which puts France second in the world for its carrier force. That would include Bern from 1928, 17,700 tons, 29 knots, 16 5-inch guns, 27 aircraft. I'm going to assume that's post-jet conversion, which has definitely, she will not be suited for that, let's be honest. Then the two mid-30s Joffre and Lafayette, 28,800 tons, 28 knots, 16 5-inch guns, 58 aircraft as built, 35 after jet conversion. Most of these older ships really should be replaced instead of being converted to jet operations. They're just not capable of carrying. I mean, 35 is not nothing, obviously, but they're not going to ever operate them perfectly efficiently either, unless they actually go for angled flight decks, which they might be, but that's a big cost too. I question the utility, I do, yeah. Now, they do have, from the early to mid 40s, Painlev, Boisbelot, Foch, and Rochambeau, all of a class, pardon my horrific French, 39,200 tons, 29 knots, 16 5-inch guns. Originally carried 100 aircraft, we can see. Now 69 after jet operations, which means that these at least are still viable platforms in the jet age, unlike a lot of these smaller and older carriers we've been looking at. Most recently, they've built Commandant Test and Clemenceau. Well, actually built them almost contemporaneously, but 21,000 tons, 29 knots, 12 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 43 aircraft. I'm going to assume those are probably jets. Although they're rather small to be operating 43 jets, but they can probably do it. And they're now building the 44,000-ton Verdun. So overall, I mean, it's quite a potent... well, it's going to be some horrific mix of... Let's just assume that they're going to finish all their jet conversions shortly. Gives them 459 aircraft operating from their fleet carriers. Additionally, they have the light carrier Souverain, 14,500 tons, 30 knots, 13 aircraft. Sphinx, Ville de Paris, and Protecteur, 11,500 tons, 28 knots, 28 aircraft. Definitely not converted to jet operations yet. And Dauphine from the early 40s, 15,300 tons, 32 knots, 15 aircraft. And they're building Pupil and Dixmude. All told, let's just basically say 15 apiece. That's going to add about another 75 to their total capacity. Call it something on the order of 534 sea-based aircraft in the French Naval Air Arm. Not bad at all, although I'm fairly confident we've got them beat. But nonetheless, now Germany is not in a terrible place, but is not doing super well carrier-wise, with 5 in service, plus 6 light carriers, amounting to 177,000 tons, and that counts the 2 that are under construction, of course. In service, they only have well, three Europas from the mid 30s, 31,400 tons, 31 knots, 16 4-inch guns, 59 aircraft. That probably is post-jet conversion, and to be fair, it's a very respectable number of aircraft, so those are a good design. The weird thing is that after that, their carrier program has just tailed off completely. They built the one-off, after Europa Grafspeed said this, they built the one-off Derflinger, 23,700 tons, 29 knots, 16 4-inch guns, 42 aircraft, probably jets, but still. And then even more bafflingly, they're currently building the Goben class, Goben finished, and then Peter Strasser and Hertha building only 19,700 tons apiece, 27 knots, 16 3-inch guns, 33 aircraft. I'm sure they're jets, but still, did nobody give Germany the memo that carriers trend larger on average as time goes on and not smaller? Why is every succeeding class less capable? Yeah, I don't understand that at all. The Europas are even faster than the new ones. Like, what are they doing here? Why are they building the Gobens in 1949 when they could build an Europa that's just better in every way 15 years ago? Yeah, not following that. Then they still have some older light carriers. Rhine from 1926, 8,100 tons, 22 knots, 24 aircraft. And then Ozonia, Salzach, Jade, and Veals from the late 20s, 14,200 tons, 30 knots, 13 aircraft after jet conversion, 30 before. And Prims, 10,900 tons, 29 knots, 32 aircraft, not converted to jets yet. Practically speaking, they're going to have about close on to 220, 250, and then, I don't know, 325, about 325 aircraft, definitely beaten by the French numbers by about 200. And not impressed by their building trend. I mean, most of the other AI countries are at least building a new 40,000 ton carrier or two. Germany is going smaller for some reason, which is all right if they're just in the North Sea, I suppose, but not if they intend to project global power. Now, Japan, our closest overall naval rival, especially in gun capital ships, not doing terribly in carriers, but not as well as France or Britain either, with 8 fleet carriers, which to be fair is the third most, but only 181,000 tons means they're not very large on average, and then 5 light carriers. Now, these are Hosho and Hiryu from the early 30s, 18,300 tons, 28 knots, 16 5-inch guns, carry 31 aircraft. I assume that is post-jet conversion. They carried 53 before. 31 is just verging on, like, why do you really have this carrier, though? So, I don't know. I mean, they can still field a strike squadron or two off of those, just not, the big American fleet carriers will comfortably beat them, let's be honest. Then Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku from the late 30s. 21,600 tons, 30 knots, 12 4-inch guns, 46 aircraft. I think it's probably safe to say that is post-jet conversion. In which case they did pretty well on the numbers with that jet conversion too, I think. So maybe it's not even, but I think it should be. So those are pretty reasonable carriers for the size that they are. But obviously they're not huge in modern or anything. Then Akagi and Hio, 27,400 tons, 31 knots, 16 4-inch guns, 55 aircraft. That's also probably post-jet conversion, but it's hard to be sure. And then most recently, they finished Shinano, 24,900 tons, 30 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 45 aircraft. To be fair to the Japanese, although they don't have any sort of large... Man, a lot of pop-ups today. They don't have any large, what you'd call, super carriers or anything super carrier adjacent, but they do have a pretty substantial number of hulls. They're all cohesive. None of them are hugely larger than the others. And they've got 355 aircraft out of those 8 fleet carriers. Plus, they have the 3 Chitoses from the late 20s, which 14,500 tons, 30 knots, 30 aircraft originally, 13 after conversion. Junyo from the early 30s, 13,200 tons, 30 knots, 15 aircraft now. And Shimane Maru, 15,200 tons, 31 knots, 15 aircraft from the early 40s. The five of those are going to add about another 75 aircraft, so 430, which more than Germany, but still about 100 less than France, which is definitely second in the race at the moment. And then we have the U.S. carrier fleet. Currently 11 carriers strong, with another 4 building. Now that's going to be. Hold on, let me just. I haven't actually reconfigured. No, I have partially. Right. Okay, just wanted to check to be sure here. So the older U.S. carriers are the 3 surviving Langley class, built in 1930, 21,400 tons, 30 knots, 8 6-inch guns, and 10 a dual-purpose 4-inch, 2-inch belt, 1-inch deck, and 60 aircraft. These are, well, they are definitely obsolete in 1950, let's be honest. On the other hand, compared to what the AI is still throwing around, they're not exactly that bad. I mean, okay, France is the second largest naval power, and they have plenty of Bairns or Joffreys or such, which are probably close in performance to a Langley. Although they have better too, but so do we. Anyway, Langley, Wasp, and Yorktown are definitely on the list for disposal relatively soon. In fact, pretty much as soon as the next class is completed. But are not hopeless in 1950 necessarily. Then we have the Enterprise class, built in 1938-39. Enterprise, Franklin, Bunker Hill, and Hancock. 31,400 tons, 30 knots, 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 3-inch belt, 3 inches of deck armor, and an inch of flight deck armor, and carry 80 aircraft. Now, the AI has definitely at times crammed more aircraft into a hole this size, but I do believe my carriers are some of the best armored in the world. I could be wrong, but I do believe that they are. And overall, obviously, the Enterprises haven't been converted to jet operations. They could probably still carry about 50 aircraft or so if they were. Whether that will ever happen, probably not, only because the U.S. has the budget to replace them at a very high rate, and I believe that is what happened. But these are definitely still viable combat units compared to most of the AI carriers floating around. And they don't necessarily have to be decommissioned anytime soon. It's just that the U.S. budget allows them to be replaced much faster than the AI will be able to replace theirs. The first sort of currently the heads of the U.S. carrier force are USS Ticonderoga, Ranger, Intrepid, and Antietam, built 1943-44, 38,200 tons, 30 knots, 16 5-inch and 10 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 3-inch belt, 3-inch deck, 1-inch flight deck, originally built to carry 100 piston-engined aircraft. They are our first carriers capable of jet operations and currently carry 58 aircraft in that form, which I will note is not so impressive compared to some of the conversions. Like the French have gotten 69 out of the Painleves, which are 39,200 tons. But I believe we're much better armored than them, most likely. Now, even so, obviously we have no light carriers, but the U.S. still flies off, well, 232 jet aircraft from the Ticonderogas alone, plus another 500 aircraft from the others for 732. Now, to be fair, if we assume maybe 50 generously from the Enterprises, and like 35 from the Langleys, that puts us at 537 or so, which is very, very comparable to the French fleet. Albeit I don't think all of the French were converted to jet operations in the calculation I made. Maybe they were, though, actually. Maybe I did do that. So we're probably not too far ahead of France at the moment. That said, that is changing, as while France is currently only building a couple of, well, one Verdun and a couple of light carriers. The U.S. already has laid down in 1950 USS Shangri-La, Hornet, Bennington, and Randolph, all due for the next year. In fact, scheduled to be completed in 16 months. And these are 47,000 ton, 32 knot carriers, 16 4-inch, 16 3-inch dual purpose guns, 3-inch belt, 3-inch deck, 1-inch flight deck. They carry 72 jet aircraft apiece for a total of 288. Look at that, I can do some math. And they will replace the 3 remaining Langleys, get us back up to 12 carriers, and that will give the U.S. a force of what? Well, assume we converted the Enterprises to jets, which I don't think we ever did, but that would give us about 720 jet aircraft, which is not too bad at all. And, well, spoilers, but I know for a fact the U.S. built an even larger class of carriers within a couple of years of 1950 to boot. So overall, I would say the U.S. is the conclusions for 1950. Battleships and battlecruisers are definitely on their way out across the world. The U.S. pretty much certainly has the strongest remaining fleet of gun-armed capital ships across most of the rest of the world. Cruisers are very much in to a greater extent than they are in the U.S. I still think that the gun-armed capital ships are kind of relevant, especially if you can build fast 30-knot ones that can operate alongside or ahead of carriers. That said, obviously we haven't neglected the carrier arm. It's pretty much certainly still the strongest in the world, given that I believe our carriers overall are better armored, probably carry better aircraft than, and tend to be a bit faster than the French carriers. And certainly we have many more aircraft than anybody that's not France. Why France has ended up with so many relative to everyone else, I don't know. But anyway, we are very much entering the carrier era proper. Capital ships, gun-armed capital ships still hanging around but fading. Cruisers becoming more and more important in the absence of gun-armed capital ships. Destroyers also growing in size. Surface-to-surface missiles beginning to, and air-to-surface missiles, if not already, then very soon, beginning to make their debut. Times are changing very quickly in 1950. After, honestly, the last 20 years or so, really were kind of stable in terms of the basics of ship design. Although radar and electrical direction made a big difference, but even the last 30 years, really, since the Dreadnought Revolution stabilized, a little stable, just growing. But now things are really changing generationally, and we will see where that takes us in the next 10 years. Thank you all for watching. I hope you have a nice day. This is Sea Lord Janda, signing off.